Hello and welcome to Module 6 in the Risk-Based Decision-Making short course. Module 6 is going to be about types of decision in food safety. So the learning objectives for this module are to recognize the various types of decisions that are made about food safety by different actors, and then to understand those different roles that different actors have within the food safety system in terms of the types of decisions. So I wanted to remind you of something we covered in the earlier modules, which is the PRO-ACT model, which is something that the field of decision analysis has put forward as a simple way to synthesize all the key elements of decision analysis research recommendations in terms of what makes for a good decision-making process. So that model is shown here. There are 5 steps. And while we're going through all these examples of different types of decisions and different types of decision makers in the food safety system, I want you to keep these steps in mind. Remember, we're thinking about what is the problem that we're trying to solve. What is that really involves what's the scope of the problem? What are you focusing on? What are you trying to solve? Then what are the outcomes that you care about? So what are the things that will happen as a result of this decision that you want to keep track of because you want to use that when you're choosing what the best option is? What are the alternatives or options for the decision? So not just having one option and saying yes or no, but having a lot of different options, including the status quo option, which means doing nothing, or we also could call it the do nothing option, and thinking about what all those alternatives might be before making a decision. And the consequences is when the step in which you assess all those options in terms of the outcomes, so you really understand what each of the options will give you in terms of all the things you care about. And then finally, what are the trade-offs? If you can't have all the outcomes that you really want, what are the things you're willing to give up? And in addition to things that are relevant for your own decision making, if you're making these decisions on behalf of other people, like if you work for the government, for example, or for a large organization, you also should think about what are the priorities of those other stakeholders in terms of these trade-offs and in terms of the outcomes they might care about. Okay, so with that in mind, again, keep that framework in mind in terms of what makes a good decision. I'm going to walk through 3 main types of decision makers in the food safety system. And those are really big categories of types of decisions, and within those, as we'll talk about, there's many different types of specific decisions that might be made. Many of them are overlapping, even though they're in different groups of types of decision makers, so you'll have a better idea to go through it. But again, keep in mind these 5 steps, especially the idea of defining what are the outcomes you care about and really defining a good list of options that you care about before making the decision. So first I wanted to show you this figure, which is from the CDC, the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the public health agency for the United States, and they're the ones who keep track of numbers of foodborne illnesses, causes of foodborne illnesses, as well as, of course, many other kinds of illnesses. So they play that role in the food safety system in the United States. So the food production chain really gives us a map of all the stakeholders, all the decision makers we're going to talk about today. So you can start from production, people that are actually on the farm producing, that's part of the food industry or the private sector decision makers. Also, that production goes through processing and distribution, and also to restaurant and retail. It also could include food service, so we'll talk about these in terms of there's a large number of different kinds of actors and decision makers in the private sector of the food safety system. And then at the bottom of the figure is more the consumers or household decision makers, so food service workers, people that work in institutions that are interacting with food and providing the food to people to consume. And then also, of course, in your own home, in your household, you're also making decisions about food safety that can impact the system. So what not shown in this chart is the government agencies that kind of oversee all of these processes to different degrees, depending on how your laws are written. So those are the three decision maker groups we're going to talk about today. One is the government decision makers, and we're going to talk about the kinds of decisions that they are faced with. Then the private sector decision makers, which includes most of this chart in terms of all the people that are playing a role in getting the food from where it's produced to where it's being consumed. And then finally, the third group is the household or consumer level decision makers. And so I'll go through decisions in each of those sectors, and again, keep in mind those 5 steps in a good decision-making practice when you're thinking about those, so that we can really bring together these ideas of decision-making, especially risk-based decision-making, and the food safety system. Okay, here we go. So the first types of decisions in food safety that we're going to talk about are government decisions. So what I have on the slide are different examples of the types of decisions that government people might be making. And these could be people in a parliament or legislature that are voting on new laws. These could be people that work in the executive branch, in the agencies themselves, making decisions about how to implement them. And they also could be people not only in the federal agencies, but also in the local agencies who are working to maybe implement some of the federal regulations, or maybe even develop regulations of their own. So the first type, and I wanted to mention, this list is not comprehensive. This is meant to really give you a sense of all the different kinds of decisions that might be happening in the food safety system. So I don't want you to think that this is everything, but hopefully this will give you a good sense of the wide variety of different types of decisions that the government decision makers might need to address. So I'm just going to walk through this list, and then I have a couple of pictures in the next slide. So first, decisions about what foods to regulate and how to regulate them. It's a very big decision. And then specifically what standards to set for which foods and pathogens. So how you're going to go about setting what the expectation is in terms of different foods and pathogens is a big set of decisions that the government must make. Related to that is what pathogens or hazards to conduct surveillance on. So this has to do more with using sampling resources to take samples or take samples either of the food, or maybe have samples in the hospitals if it's the public health side of things, and then to analyze those in the laboratory to find out what hazards are potentially in those. So deciding how you're going to collect data on which hazards, and whether you're doing it on the food side in terms of collecting samples and analyzing those in the lab, how you're going to collect those samples, what you're going to focus on, and then also decisions about the public health side, which is kind of the disease side. What data are you going to collect diseases on? How are you going to analyze those samples that you have, and how are you going to manage that data and make decisions from it? Another big decision also related to those first 2 points is how to monitor food safety. So what are the signals that are being used? And we can talk a lot about the signals that are used in the United States to basically give the decision makers information about if there's an outbreak, if there's a surge in illnesses that are related to each other that might lead to decisions about launching an investigation, and decisions about collecting more data. So those could be a cascade of decisions. But what are the ways that the government's going to use to get signals on potential food safety problems? That's a big decision. And then finally, and these are all very related to each other, of course, is how to regulate the private sector. What are the rules that are going to be put into place? What are the legislation that's needed? Will there be guidance? Will there be training and outreach about good practices? Basically, what's the government's role in terms of incentivizing the private sector to make food safety decisions that are in the interest of the citizens of the country that you're working in? So, and finally, the last one is decisions about communicating about emerging risk information. So I talked about the signals that you might get. There's signals coming in all the time in the United States, and there are decisions that are made about when to communicate about those to the media, when to communicate about those to the public, what to say in those communications, what kind of information is conveyed, how much evidence do you need before you share that information with media, and so on. So these are all very critical, as you can see, decisions in the food safety realm for the government. And I talk about the government first because they really do kind of set the framework for how the other actors will move forward in the food safety system. If there's a lot of requirements from the government, then the private sector will mostly be responding to those. If there's fewer requirements, then the private sector might be motivated by other types of pressures and drivers as we'll talk about in the next set of decisions. So I just want to share a few pictures of government decisions and kind of give these examples. So a question getting more down into detail, what inspection process will be undertaken? What will be the role of, will there be people who are going to plants? Will there be information collected from those facilities? How's that information being stored and managed? And again, mined for signals. And then also questions about what data will companies be required to collect. The United States just went through a large implementation of a large new piece of legislation called FSMA, which has many changes in the requirements that that food companies must complete in terms of collecting data and keeping that data available for review if necessary. So the decision about what data to require companies to collect is another example of an important government decision in food safety. So again, think about all these decisions that I just went through, and think about those 5 steps, really defining the outcomes that you care about. There might be a lot of things related to, of course, reducing risk, which you might use different metrics as we talked about in Module 5. There could be different kinds of risk metrics you care about, depending on what kind of data you have available. Then you also want to make sure you look at all the different options you might have, not just assume there's one approach to implementing a new requirement, but really look at all the different ways that it could be achieved and looking at all the different trade-offs that you might have to make. All right, so now let's move into decisions in food safety in the private sector. Now the private sector is, as I showed you on that figure initially, a very large and complex part of the food safety system. And a lot of the time, the food supply chain, kind of that movement of food from production through processing to storage and transport, is the information. There's all these different companies and organizations that are part of that. So having information that really tells the story of the whole supply chain is sometimes a challenge. So the private sector will make decisions on how to identify and manage risks within their food supply chain, and so these decisions would include not only food manufacturers, the people that are producing the food, but also transportation, storage, and distribution. These all might be different companies that you're interacting with as a private sector food manufacturer. And then also retail, food service, and restaurant are included in our definition of the private sector, because those are private businesses that are interacting with food and the consumers, and the decisions that they make are important in terms of the safety of the food. So the private sector will make decisions kind of setting us, of course, whatever government requirements are in place will drive some of this behavior in the private sector. But when there aren't regulations in certain areas that the food sector might care about, they might take additional steps for their own interest. They're, of course, interested in protecting the value of the company. They have stockholders who want to make sure that the company's not going to run into huge problems, have food that causes a lot of illnesses that would not be good for the longevity of the company. So they have their own, in addition to being incentivized by government regulation, they're also incentivized by their stockholders to make good decisions about the safety of their food. And then, so 2 kind of major categories of decisions that these groups might be making are, what risks are you concerned about? What hazards and what foods are the ones that you're going to focus your resources on? Again, in a risk-based system, we're always assuming there are limited resources, that it's not unlimited resources to address risk. So deciding where you're going to address those resources is an important prioritization decision. And then what can you do to reduce them? What are the tools that you have in your toolkit, in your control, that you can implement to reduce the likelihood of harm from the food that you're providing. So again, this would include food production, which would include the original source, the agricultural sources of the food, all the way up through food processing and storage and so on. So again, think about those decisions in terms of the 5 elements that we talked about. What is the problem you're trying to solve? What are the outcomes that you care about in terms of the decisions? Of course, in the private sector, there is going to be a concern about cost, and that's perfectly reasonable. You want these solutions to be sustainable and to not put the company out of business. But you're also concerned about reducing risk, and you might be concerned about other things, the safety of your employees, the relationships you have with suppliers. All those things are perfectly rational outcomes to include in these decision-making processes for the private sector. And then finally, we have consumer and household decisions, which we don't talk a lot about in the food regulation world, because of course there aren't really regulations put on households. But in terms of reducing risk, in terms of managing food safety and decreasing risk, the consumer household is actually a really critical element. And there's been a good percent of foodborne cases that have been traced back to improper handling in the home. So the way that you would think about this as a consumer would be to say, how do I reduce risk? And you have to kind of have some understanding of what the risk is and how it can be reduced. So you're making decisions all the time as a consumer, and these may or may not be informed by food safety concerns at this point, but hopefully with good education and outreach and training, people can have information that will help them include food safety in their decisions about what foods to prepare and consume, how to prepare the food, how to buy food, that is who to buy it from, how to store food, and how to serve food. So all of these are things that people do all the time in their households. And as food supplies change and as the food system changes, there might be adaptations that need to be made to these processes to make sure that the food that you're serving to your family and your friends is safe. So these are another set of decisions that are an important part of reducing food safety risk. So I hope that was a helpful review of the types of decisions that food safety that occur in the food safety system. And just to recap the learning objectives for this module, to remind you, hopefully these are the things that we were able to do for you, to recognize the various types of decisions that are made about food safety, and then to understand the different roles of the different types of decision makers in these food safety decisions. Thank you.